kids that are here. I've seen you all have been here since 8 o'clock, and that's wonderful. Uh, no, I don't need that. That's fine. Uh, so inflammation, if you remember from your pathology, was one of the most boring topics, and probably remains so even today. Although its importance, I think, is much, much more than what it was in good old days. So what I plan to do in the next 15 minutes or so is take you very briefly through these different topics, linking inflammation with various cardio and metabolic disorders. A little brief of type 2 diabetes in India, probably all of you know most of this. And then link inflammation with obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And the whole exercise is to set the ball for the next talk, which will be a clinical talk on what we can do for treating this inflammation. So the definition of inflammation, just to refresh your memories, because you must have read this about 3 decades ago or even more. Basically, the features, I'm not going to read the definition to you, involves scalar, dolor, rubor, tumor, and functionalisa, which covers up the 5 properties of inflammation in terms of heat, pain, redness, swelling, and because of these factors put you loss of function of that part. And that's something which has stood the test of time for even about 5 decades or so. Time and again, I'm going to refer to inflammation and its relation here. So I think let's spend a little time looking at this so that I don't have to repeat this every time the mention of inflammation comes up. Because inflammation is sort of started off by the generation of free radicals, which are damaging. And please excuse my using abbreviation, because again, that becomes a very long thing. So the NF-kappa beta is one of the biggest culprits in this whole chain. But there are various other cytokines which have been incriminated in different organs at different times. But the end result is whichever way you start, whether it's TNF alpha, TGF beta, PKC, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, arachidonic acid, the end result is activation of nuclear factor kappa beta, NF-kB, which then sets off this chain reaction. And that's what we now need to look in the next few slides, what happens in terms of atherosclerosis, diabetes, and the metabolic syndrome. This is something which all of us know. Indians are more prone to diabetes and probably more prone to complications. But what is most important is we tend to get diabetes about a decade earlier as compared to Caucasians. We had complications also about a decade earlier and probably more than what you get in the Caucasians. And we'll see why that is. But what is not there in this slide is that from the epidemiological studies within the country, we are, in our own population, we are getting now the disease maybe a decade or 15 years earlier than what it was before this. The curve is shifting towards the left. I have purposely hidden that slide because 15 minutes was too less, because this was an original 40-minute talk. For those who are from Pune, they know who this person is, but let me introduce Professor Yudkin, who is a great friend of Professor Yagnik. And in 2004, there was a publication in Lancet comparing these two stalwarts in research with a BMI of 22.3, as you can see here at the top. But that's where the similarity ended, because if you go below and you look at the body fat, Yudkin is a marathon runner. His body fat is less than 10%. Dr. Yagnik, his BMI is 22, but his body fat was, I don't know what it is today, but he can correct me, but it was about 20% or so. So the interesting point is that even we are thin compared to the Caucasians, we are still fat. So that's how this thin fat Indian term came about 16 years ago and persists today. It's been time and again shown that we are much fatter when it comes to the various parameters that they're looking at. So if you were to compare the two, the lean mass, the European phenotype, that's the lean mass and that's the body fat, you can see our fat mass is more compared to the lean mass. And what this leads to is a situation where there is accumulation of the metabolic load or the body fat, but the increase in metabolic capacity is not matching the increase in the BMI, the increase in the metabolic load, and that's where we get into trouble. And probably this elevated ratio is what increases the risk of diabetes in our population. A little busy slide. Let's start at the bottom so it makes things easier for us. We know type 2 diabetes occurs because of two defects, not the 12 defects that DeFrancois keeps talking about. The basic defects is there's insulin resistance and there isn't enough beta cell function to compensate for the insulin resistance. A very simple thing is, if you have insulin resistance, which most obese people do have, they don't become diabetic as long as the beta cell takes care of it. So this is the important part I want you to remember, which probably you already know. But how does this come about? And that's where now we can start looking about. So on the adipose tissue side, increased metabolic load, going into the adipose tissue, increased production of cytokines. I'm not going to repeat them now. And what comes into the adipose tissue is from the circulation, increased adipokines, decreased adiponectin. The poor adiponectin is the only good fellow in that whole scheme of things, and then decreased in diabetic patients. And at the same time, the beta cytotoxicity theory also comes into play, where these free fatty acids enter, increased generation of the free reactive oxygen species, which leads to poor beta cell function. And that's in a nutshell how inflammation affects at the adipose tissue and the beta cell, leading to production of development of type 2 diabetes. In terms of complication also, whether we are talking in terms of macrovascular complications, again, the proatherogenetic mediators affecting the large vessels and the smaller vessels also. The bottom line being the advanced glycosylation end products, oxidative stress, hypoxia, whatever you say, the initiating process may be something, but the end line is the inflammatory cytokines, the inflammation, and the end organ damage. So whether we're talking of nerves, we're talking of the microvessels in the retina or in the kidney, but somehow they all seem to be mechanistically linked. Now, this was the basic background to lay how things are happening. But how does this translate now into clinical proof? And then the last part will be, how do we use this information for managing our patients? So there are a whole lot of inflammatory cytokines that you all know of, starting with the very simple white blood count, which we learned in college, that inflammation leads to increase in white blood cell count. And then you've got fancy cytokines, then you've got acute phase reactants, HSCRPs being used often. And then if you have a research laboratory, you can look at CD8 T cells, CD4 T cells, CD19 plus B cells. So there are a whole lot of inflammatory cytokines that are there for us. But I guess what is easily done, even in the simplest of labs, is a white blood cell count and an HSCRP. So these are things that we can carry probably home today, that if we look at these markers, we can get some idea of what is happening in an individual. There are prospective studies which have looked at what happens in terms of the onset of diabetes. So these are prospective cohort studies. The length of follow-up has been reasonable. It's about 5 years. They've looked at different inflammatory cytokines and have shown, as expected, that it is elevated more than one, and the poor adiponectin is reduced in at least one study. Similarly, a second meta-analysis, huge number of patients, nearly 40,000 participants, nearly 8,000 diabetic patients. You find that most of the inflammatory cytokines are increased, and as I mentioned earlier also, adiponectin is decreased. There is a study from India also, without going into details, you see from normoglycemic to impaired fasting glucose to hyperglycemia, the interleukin 6 tends to go up, and similarly the HSCRP also goes up. So there is evidence. It's not tens of thousands, but there is evidence to show that these inflammatory cytokines are increased. And looking back from the WASCOPS, which was a huge primary prevention study, when they looked at the outcomes in terms of metabolic syndrome, yes, no metabolic syndrome, no metabolic syndrome, and then HSCRP less than 3 or more than 3, the development of diabetes over 8 years went on increasing as the metabolic syndrome came up and the HRCRP went up. So again, an indirect marker, but still an important marker. Simple thing like I mentioned, this is also very innovative. Long-term follow-up of a cohort of patients and the development of diabetes. And what was interesting is that in this cohort also, those who had a higher blood count, see, we learned in college that it's 4,000 to 11,000 is the normal white blood cell count. But even within that count, if you're touching 7,000 plus, the patient has a higher chance of developing type 2 diabetes. I know these are circumstantial evidence, but still put together, too many circumstantial evidences together become really strong. And similarly, this is from the DPP study, where they've looked at the adiponectin, and you can see patients who are on good lifestyle modification, their adiponectin levels were actually going up, and their diabetes hazard ratio went on decreasing. So all in all, you have good amount of clinical evidence showing you that with the increase in the inflammatory markers, with decrease in adiponectin, the risk of diabetes has gone up. This is one interventional mouse study where an antibody to tumor necrosis factor actually reduces insulin resistance. Probably last 2 decades, there have been bursts of publications. 2001 in JAMA, which looked at the inflammatory markers in developing type 2 diabetes. 2004, Trends in Immunology talked about inflammation and diabetes. 2011, Nature Review also talked about type 2 diabetes as an inflammatory disease. And in 2013. And the last 2-3 years, there's been a burst of publications, so I couldn't put it in this slide. How is this information going to be useful for us? I mean, at the end of the day, what do we do with information? We want to turn it into some therapeutic targets so that our patients can improve, so that we can reduce the risk of developing diabetes or progressing to complications. And there are various drugs which are being looked at. You all heard of methotrexate, which is again being used a lot to reduce atherothrombotic CVD. Etanercept is an antibody against TNF alpha, and you have on this side anakinra, which is a monoclonal antibody against interleukin 1 beta. So fact is, there are drugs which have been developed, which are being tried. This is a list which has been given up here, and actually I'm very happy if anyone wants the PDF of these slides. If they go to the IPCA stall, you can ask for them and they'll be able to share it with you. At least the names, something which were new for even for myself when I started doing these talks 2 years ago. But what we have with us is a list of drugs, the old salicylate. These are etanercept, anakinra, canakinumab. These have not really come into the market. These are more into phase 3 only. But methotrexate you've been using if you're handling the collagen vascular disorders. And hydroxychloroquine has been around for years together, but now has got a new role in the last 2 or 3 years probably, so which you'll be hearing more details in the next talk. But the fact remains that if you were to compare these drugs from the phase 3 to now, the use of hydroxychloroquine in market, these are very expensive. No, this is not expensive, but these are very expensive drugs. They have got some modest reduction in A1C, which most of our patients would not be able to afford it. And in terms of say a 0.4% or 0.5%, it's just not worth the cost. With canakinumab, there was a modest decrease in CV events and some modest decrease in A1C also. Whereas with hydroxychloroquine, now that it's been 3 years plus that the DCGI has also cleared it for use as an add-on in type 2 diabetes, there's been a lot of publications, phase 3 to phase 4 now, which has looked at a decent placebo compared A1C reduction. I would say around 1% to be on average. This looks too good to be true, but it's there. So I'm not denying that. But even if we keep that as 1%, it matches most of our DPP-4s and SGLT2s. So this is something which we need to look forward to in our practice. So in conclusion, I have actually given you a brief in terms of diabetes being an inflammatory disorder. I've tried to put in some new, some old terms in terms of cytokines, the importance of low adiponectin in causing diabetes, and hopefully if there was something to elevate adiponectin, we'll be able to reduce the development or the progression of type 2 diabetes. Various anti-inflammatory drugs have been used in practice. There have been phase 3 studies with not so good results, and the outcomes with hydroxychloroquine have been pretty impressive, about 1% A1 reduction. I think most of you know when you say average 1%, then the range could be 0.5 to even 2%. And in terms of its efficacy and safety, the next speaker is going to give you more details, so I don't want to go into his field of purview. So I'm going to end at this stage, and maybe we'll take questions later on. And till the next speaker comes on, I'm going to leave you with this slide, again connecting whatever I spoke to you in the last 15 minutes, how inflammation leads to production of the reactive free oxygen species, leads to defect in the beta cell function, leads to increase in insulin resistance, and leads to increase type 2 diabetes. Thank you very much.